Hello, and this is Olivia. As requested, you asked for a little tutorial on any tips with watercolors. Excuse the camera angle as I am balancing my iPad on a chair. First world problems. So, to start, I have my watercolor sketchbook. I feel the paper makes a huge difference in the kind of experience that you get with your watercolors, because sort of normal printer paper tends to kind of curl up or even get damaged enough that the paper is no longer flat, or there are even holes in that you can poke through the paper if it's too wet. So as you can see, I have my kind of essential materials. So I'll start with how I usually start my drawings in watercolors. It's a lot easier if you start with sort of a base to what you do. So I'll start with my pencil, and this has a nice little eraser on the top, which is going to come in handy later. So if I wanted to, say, draw a pastoral scene with perhaps some water looking out into the distance. So maybe it's like a lake or something. So I'll have a little form kind of come out from the horizon there. So I've kind of established that my horizon line's through sort of the center here. And I have my sort of reflection into the water, and I have my vegetation here. And then there's going to be water here, and then I'll have a bit of a skyline in the top section. So if I wanted to include like a little sort of building or something, I have a tip for drawing straight lines. So if you're having trouble with like houses and architecture, it's really important to know how to discover sort of your sight lines. So say I wanted to draw a three-dimensional object in space, I would draw my two vantage points in some cases. In this in particular, it's going to be just the one vantage point because it's a landscape and it's just sort of flat all the way through. But say, for example, on the other page, if I had like a little sort of like house and there's like a rooftop, and you can see that it's going off into two different sort of directions for sort of the building. That's when I would have two different sort of vantage points on either side, kind of heading off into that sort of space and direction. If that makes sense. You kind of, as you start to draw, you'll kind of get a little bit more comfortable with vantage points over time, but generally I find if I can have like a picture I'm basing my work off of, I squint with one eye and then I just sort of align my pencil to the angle that I'm looking at. So if their building's kind of tipped like this way, I'll just hold my pencil there, and then I can use that as a guideline to directing my pencil sort of across the page in the direction of that building. And then the vantage points are just a way to keep all of those lines nice and consistent. So I want to have a little house coming off from my vantage point into this sort of landing here. So the best way to draw a straight line is to apply pressure and then release it very quickly. I mean, this experience is different for everyone. I've had some people say that they really like light lines and it's just drawing really fast. So whatever kind of works for you in the moment, but I do enjoy my sort of releasing sort of tension and making sure I'm looking at the vantage point. I find in drawing, like if you want to create a certain motion, you should be looking towards the spot that you want to draw it. So I have a nice little vantage point here, and I have my two lines going straight down, and then, that's something. That's sort of an example of where actually I would have a second vantage point because there's more lines heading off this way. So that's created a nice little three-dimensional object there. And I will finish it off just a little average house with my second vantage point. And draw that line, and everything lines up really nicely. So of course I'm not going to have that be so structured. I'm going to have a bit of vegetation in front of it and mess around. But now that I've created this sort of house shape that I like, I am going to then outline it with pen. You can also do this with paints and erase the pencil later. So, I mean, if I wanted to go straight in with the painting, I could do that and erase it. Though generally, I like to do ink and watercolors together, but that's not necessarily like tradition or anything. So see if I can demonstrate erasing pencil in just like a spot. So I'll wait for that to dry. While that's sort of being demonstrated, I will do lines on my house. And I'm just gonna not draw in the bottom, just so that I have that. See, like I have this sort of nice sort of outline to what I would like to draw, and then I can just erase all these little bits of vantage points and it'll look quite nice. So the general idea is to not apply your pencil marks too hard, or it'll leave behind marks that are just so impossible to remove, but it also depends on the pencil you plan on using. So I'm going to erase the rest of this sort of line. Whoop, lost my eraser here. Okay. So that was sort of my first bit of recommendation. If you're starting out doing watercolors, I wouldn't generally go in straight with them because watercolors can be so finicky. There's so much room for bleed on the paper that I find it can be really hard to kind of create these really like even with watercolors, they can be so structured, and if you want to have that sort of structure and realistic resemblance, it can be very difficult to go straight in with watercolors. So the pencil outline is quite useful for that reason. So now I'm going to get into the brushes that I like to use. So there's a lot more brushes than just these. So this is kind of a round-tipped brush. It can be used for calligraphy kind of stuff if you want to do that, though calligraphy can really be used with honestly any pen so long as you have an open mind as to what kind of forms you want to make. So if I wanted to make the letter H, I could drag that down. It's okay. But as you can sort of see with the round brush, we have this sort of, round, sort of kind of texture to the way it's being painted with these sort of curves here. As the sort of brush strokes kind of move around and across the page, the way it kind of moves flat across is going to just kind of create these sort of round tip sort of strokes. And as we move on to the flat brush, this one's great. This one's even better if you wanted to do, calligraphy style sort of work. If I wanted to use my round, or my flat brush rather, and I wanted to make like an H, and I drag it sort of in a down motion and across, kind of, if you get the sense that it does exactly what the brush is intended for, creates these nice sort of flat edges. These brushes are really nice if you want clean edges to things, from my experience. But my experience is pretty tactile. So, just getting my water sorted. Okie dokie. So I have all of my materials nicely sort of laid out. So if you don't already know, when it comes to painting, the colors that you have sort of on you aren't necessarily gospel. You don't have to just strictly use the colors that are given, although these are sort of a really nice range of watercolors you can use. There's always sort of often a palette. If you don't have a palette, you can use just about anything. I've used mirrors, I've used plates, dishes, bits of plastic, and yogurt lids. So just about anything where the liquid isn't absorbed, you can sort of mix colors onto. So sample for this sort of bit of water that I want on the bottom, it'll be like twilight or something, and it'll be kind of purpley. So let's see if I have my, what is this? No. Okay. So I want my sort of purpley color here, and then I'm gonna mix that with a nice sort of blue color there. Well, it's not really that blue. It's kind of brown, actually. This is gonna be super brown. Darn. As you can already tell, a lot of it's patience and experimentation. So much of painting is really just learned through experience, and sometimes it's fun. You get all these wonderful and happy accidents throughout the sort of painting experience, and it's all part of it. So I'm adding these sort of general strokes across. So you kind of gather like the sort of less water that you have sort of on your paintbrush. You can get this sort of dry sort of stippling in the paint stroke, which I like, and it almost looks like sort of water reflecting off the sort of lake. However, if you don't like that, just make sure you have a really nice concentrated bit of paint on your brush, and that'll sort of make for really solid color strokes. As you can see with watercolors, unlike other sort of paints like acrylic and oils, the negative or sort of white space is all going to be the color of your paper, which is really wonderful if you can get like brown paper and gray paper. And then I guess, so for these sort of different strokes, now I've been sort of just kind of generally applying color for fun, but if you wanted to sort of change up the sort of dilution of the color, if you wanted it to be that translucent, just adding more water to your paintbrush will just kind of create a much lighter, what's called a wash, sort of color over your painting. So with a lot of paintings in watercolor, most of the time, or not most of the time, quite often, there's many sort of paintings that will start with a wash. So if you're starting a watercolor painting with a wash, you have this sort of foundation of color, which we'll come back to later, where the whole page or specific perhaps area you want to paint over is going to be a specific color. So it's generally recommended that your wash is just that. It's very diluted sort of color that we can then kind of cover over later. So when it comes to creating what you asked about, which was sort of nice, kind of really pointed, accurate bits of sort of watercolor paint, I would say that from the watercolors I saw you use, the easiest way to maybe fix that would to be just making sure your brush isn't so saturated with water. So I tend to use a rag when I paint, or paper towel. So rags are really easy because you can just wash them later. But say I had this brush and it's just gotten so much water on it, I can sort of dab it a little bit, and it won't put so much water on the page that it's sort of spreading the watercolors around too much. And the great thing about watercolor painting is it really does require patience, and you can kind of see sort of in parts of the wash that I did that it's still sort of reflecting light, and I really have to wait until that's gone for me to be able to apply paint without it bleeding necessarily. So keeping that in mind, if you want to add color onto things, it's not a process where you can keep applying color quickly because things will just sort of bleed into each other. But that also does mean that whenever I start to say like apply more color on later, so if I were to add sort of this other, let's say this is like a nice greenish blue. If I wanted to add this over into the water, I'm kind of adding into sort of what's already there, and the colors are still going to sort of blend together on the page a little bit. As you can kind of see, it's sort of bleeding into the purple that we had before. Now, if you're ever doing watercolors and you're like, oh, darn, I really don't like how that green looks, I kind of want to pick it up and put a blue on it, you can always take your rag and sort of dab into the paper, and that'll remove some of the watercolor, but honestly, once it's on there, you can't really remove it unless you had little X-Acto knife or something to scrape back at the paper, but generally that's kind of only really used in dire circumstances for small little droplets that are just really kind of not coming off. So with watercolors, lots of iterations are generally where it's at. So the brush that I've been just using, that I didn't explain, this is what's used often as a sort of calligraphy brush for, this is like specifically a pinso bamboo brush, and it's used normally for, Chinese character, sort of traditional character drawing. But I mean, this sort of brush is often used for this sort of like pointed tip, but it's quite round in its shape, to add sort of like bigger sort of splotches of paint onto the page. But it's a very versatile brush because of this really nice point on the end. So say if I wanted to add a bit of greenery to our landscape, I'm going to take my green, and I can use my pointed edge by having it sort of directly at the perpendicular to the paper, and just add some nice vegetal sort of line work in there, and then our reflection in the water. Because there we have a reflection here, I kind of want to add in color while it's still wet, so it kind of looks as like it's just running into the water and all sort of blending in together. Yeah, so hopefully this has given you a very sort of long and unedited sense of things that you can do with your paints. If you want to try and experiment with things, if there's like stuff or anything you have questions about, let me know. And yeah, thanks for wasting time watching me paint this really weird watercolor of, let's make it a red farmhouse out on the water. See ya!